I'm Dr. Sharon Cohen, and I'm excited to talk to you about what is in the treatment pipeline for Alzheimer's disease. This is part of the Alzheimer's series on Clinical Neurological Society of America Alzheimer's presentations. I am a full-time employee of Toronto Memory Program, a salaried employee, and I have no financial conflicts of interest, but I do a lot of clinical trial work and consulting for a whole range of biotech and pharma companies involved in drug development. The goal of my presentation is to help us reflect on the current unmet need in Alzheimer's therapeutics. Why do we need a drug development pipeline? And also to understand what some of the historical challenges have been in Alzheimer's drug development. Then ultimately, I want us to recognize the major components and recent trends in the current drug development pipeline. These are very exciting and robust. So let's begin. Alzheimer's disease was designated an urgent healthcare priority as early as 2012 by the World Health Organization. It is a common, all too common, progressive, disabling, and fatal disease. The numbers are staggering, 55 million people or more worldwide, and on the rise, 75 million by 2030, 150 million by 2050. So if we don't do something substantial about this disease, we are really facing a terrible demise as we grow older. Also, not just common, but very costly is this disease. More expensive than heart disease and cancer. And in the USA, over $305 billion was the total cost, rising to $1.1 trillion in 2050 as projected. On the humanistic side, this is a highly feared disease. More feared than cancer. There's no cure. There's no prevention as yet. And for some, this disease marks a fate worse than death. Historically, we've had major obstacles in drug development for Alzheimer's disease, and we only have a handful of drugs on the market. There are several reasons for this, one being the trial population. We were historically targeting individuals who are already disabled and demented as far as their Alzheimer's disease. So they had suffered substantial brain injury with vast neuronal loss, and trying to improve the brain at biologically late stages is a real challenge. We were relying on clinical diagnoses, which we now know are not sufficiently accurate, and we will be wrong multiple percentage of time, 30% at least in the dementia stage, and in earlier stages, at least 50% of the time, we will be wrong, and a patient will not have Alzheimer's disease. And if we enroll them in the trial, then we really lose the ability to demonstrate a benefit. As far as trial designs, treatments were often of inadequate duration to give us long-term data. And as we go earlier in the trial population, endpoints needed to be stage-specific and sensitive for milder or small changes in individuals' cognition or function. As far as drug candidates, we've had challenges getting drug into the brain because of the blood-brain barrier, and we've often underdosed or had insufficient target engagement, and in the past haven't had good biomarkers or ways to tell us whether we had adequate target engagement. Other factors, other obstacles, trials have been long in Alzheimer's disease. They've been expensive and generally underfunded compared with other major therapeutic areas. They are highly burdensome with many, many outcome measures and scales, high screen fail rates, and inevitably trial patients drop out because their disease progresses, and that's one of the largest reasons why we lose patients within trials. So there have been some major advances in our field, both in terms of diagnosis and treatment. Despite these, we're not done with needing new therapies. So drug development, as I've mentioned, has been slow in Alzheimer's. We went for 20 years without any new drugs approved for AD between 2003 and 2023, no new drugs. Those approved prior to 2023 were drugs for treating symptoms, and they had modest benefit. Symptom treatment is important. I'm not being dismissive of that, but only modest benefit to symptoms with these drugs. And the drugs acted distally in the Alzheimer's pathology cascade, and so they did not prevent or slow down underlying disease. And patients may get a bump up or improvement in symptoms for a while, and then the disease would continue to progress. Importantly, none of these symptom therapies prior to 2023 have been approved for the pre-dementia or mild cognitive impairment stages of Alzheimer's disease. So individuals have to get worse before they are eligible for these treatments, according to formal indication. Since 2023, the FDA and other regulatory agencies have granted full approval to 2 disease-targeted therapies, lecanemab in 2023, donanemab in 2024, and also 1 drug approved by the FDA for a neuropsychiatric symptom of Alzheimer's, agitation, that's brexpiprazole. And very recently, just in the last month, we had 1 blood-based biomarker approved by the FDA, that's the Fujirebio p-tau217 over A-beta 42. These are all very, very important milestones in our field. And yet, we're still not satisfied, because if we look at the disease-targeted therapies, yes, they slow decline, yes, that's important, but they do not keep people stable once you start treating, and they do not reverse the disease. They also target just one aspect of a very complex biology, namely amyloid, and from the standpoint of amyloid clearance of already preformed amyloid. They are restricted to patients at the MCI and mild dementia stages, so not a broader swath of patients who are eligible. ApoE4 homozygotes may be excluded depending on the regulatory jurisdiction, and those with substantial cerebral amyloid angiopathy are not deemed safe in any regulatory jurisdiction, so they cannot be treated even though they legitimately may have Alzheimer's disease. Because of the risk of amyloid-related imaging abnormality or ARIA, MRI monitoring is required, so individuals who have pacemakers or cannot have MRIs for other reasons would again be excluded. So we narrow the funnel of people eligible for these important new therapies. And finally, not every country has approved these drugs, and in countries where they are approved, cost is not always covered. So again, patients may not have ready access. Fortunately, we have a very substantial drug development pipeline. And here you see from Dr. Jeff Cummings' recent publication this year, the updated 2025 Alzheimer's drug development pipeline. And you see it in this Wheel of Fortune style, where you have 3 concentric circles representing on the outside phase 1, middle circle phase 2, inner circle phase 3, and all of the little colored dots and icons represent unique drugs in the pipeline at the various stages. And what you'll see is the circle is populated at phase 1, 2, and 3, and a substantial number of drugs at each phase. And with the multiple colors, which reflect the mechanism of action, you see that there are multiple different ways that these drugs are acting. Those in red are targeting amyloid in one way or another, those in blue targeting tau, those in yellow targeting inflammation, and on and on. Finally, before we leave this slide, I want to point out that there are some slices to the pie here, and the green and purple wedges together represent what we used to call disease-modifying therapies, now disease-targeting therapies, therapies to slow and change the trajectory of the disease, whereas the symptomatic treatments are broken down into the orange wedge, cognitive enhancers, and those symptomatic treatments targeting neuropsychiatric phenomena. So those would be in the blue wedge. So drugs in all of these categories. So if we look at this from a numeric standpoint rather than the image, what we see in the 2025 drug development pipeline is 182 trials assessing 138 unique drugs. This is substantial, and this represents an increase from last year, from 2024, which was already a substantial drug development pipeline. And the biggest increase is actually in phase 1, where we have almost doubled the number of new drugs entering the pipeline. And as many of you know, drugs will fail between phase 1 and 2, 2 and 3, and you need to keep replenishing your pipeline. Otherwise, you will have a very diminished pipeline as drugs exit from development. So knowing that we have a substantial number coming into phase 1 is very reassuring. Almost 3/4 of the drugs, 74%, are disease-targeted therapies. And of these are broken down into small molecules, which can be delivered orally by mouth, by a pill. So that's almost 60%, and 41% are biologics given by injection. So this is similar to the 2024 drug development pipeline with the emphasis on disease modification. 25% of the pipeline is devoted to symptomatic treatments, 14% of these cognitive enhancers, 11% behavioral symptoms. And we have a substantial number of repurposed agents, meaning agents that have been approved for other disease indications, for other purposes. For example, semaglutide approved for treatment of diabetes and overweight syndrome, here being tested in the Alzheimer's drug development pipeline for disease modification in Alzheimer's. We also have a substantial interest in targeting immune processes and inflammation. 17% of the current drug development pipeline, that's 24 unique drugs involved. So who are the patients that are invited into these trials? When I started my working as a clinical trialist, all patients were at the dementia stage. We weren't talking about MCI, we couldn't identify that readily. Now we have trials spread out between the preclinical stage of disease, that's the FDA stages 1 and 2, the MCI stage, stage 3, and the dementia stage, which is the FDA stage 4, 5, and 6. So this is a long, complex disease with a clinical continuum that spans about 30 years. Different drugs are going to be appropriate for different stages and maybe more or less safe or effective at different stages. So aiming towards precision medicine and not leaving anyone behind, we now have all stages of the Alzheimer's drug development, we'll have all stages of the AD continuum represented in the 2025 pipeline. And exciting for me, 8 trials, might not sound like a lot, but these are very important 8 trials in preclinical AD. So that would be FDA stage 1 or 2, 64 trials in the MCI or stage 3, 48 trials in early AD, so MCI and mild dementia, that would be stage 3 and 4, and 103 trials allow mild AD dementia. So again, really moving towards the mild end of the spectrum. Importantly, though, we don't want to leave out people who are already quite frail and injured by the disease, because these people are suffering and they deserve opportunities for intervention and therapies. And I'm happy to say that 75 trials include moderate, severe, or any dementia stage of Alzheimer's, which is important because we saw last year a real shrinkage of availability of trials for more affected individuals. So yes, we're moving earlier, but we're including everyone as well. What about mechanism of action? Well, the traditional pathology hallmarks of Alzheimer's were described at autopsy by Dr. Alwa Alzheimer as tau, amyloid, or plaques and tangles, as he referred to them. And these were, at autopsy, aggregated proteins that were insoluble. And when we look at how much we've learned about the complexity of Alzheimer's pathophysiology, we understand that yes, there are amyloid plaques, but there's many other forms of amyloid, and there are amyloid precursor protein species, and there are lots of different ways to target amyloid, and not all amyloid subtypes are equally toxic. As far as tau, it's not just the tau tangles that are in the dead neurons, but also tau seeds that are soluble and travel from cell to cell and propagate pathology. We are very interested in inflammation, both systemic and neuroinflammation, and that includes the role of microglia and astrocytes. And we're also interested in what goes wrong with the blood-brain barrier in Alzheimer's disease, as well as a myriad of other processes. So there's something called CADRO, the Common Alzheimer's Disease Research Ontology, which describes 18 different mechanisms of action or targets for treating Alzheimer's disease. And the current 2025 pipeline tackles 15 of the 18. That's really substantial. And yes, the canonical targets of amyloid and tau are represented with 25 drugs targeting amyloid in various ways, 15 targeting tau. But you can see that that is not even the majority, is not even 50% of the drug development pipeline that we have. We have 30 drugs targeting neurotransmitters, that's a large group, 24 targeting inflammation and immune processes, 9 drugs addressing synaptic plasticity and neuroprotection, 8 drugs targeting metabolism, and so on. I have a few more on the next slide here just to show you that the list goes on, and even targeting ApoE and trying to make an ApoE4 act more like an ApoE2 or 3. These are very exciting and very different approaches. And you'll see at the bottom of my list here that there are 3 drugs that are felt to be multi-targeted. So one drug that acts in multiple different ways to protect the brain. So now if we look even within CADRO categories, it gets even more exciting in my mind because, for example, if we talk about amyloid as a target, yes, great, but you can clear amyloid or you could prevent it from being formed. You could clear it in a number of ways. You could clear different species of amyloid. Maybe the protofibrils, maybe the oligomers are more toxic, or maybe you want to concentrate on clearing plaque. We have a drug in the drug development pipeline, an important one that combines an anti-amyloid antibody with a transferrin shuttle receptor so that we can get more drug, more antibody into the brain. And that represents the pharmacokinetic combination where we're taking a drug, pairing it with another kind of molecule so that we can deliver more to the brain. There are drugs preventing oligomer formation. So monomers are fairly non-toxic, but when when monomers become amyloid oligomers, that's where we start seeing toxicity, and there are drugs to prevent oligomer formation. One thing I'm very excited about is RNA interference targeting amyloid precursor protein. So here, this is a genetic approach preventing formation of the daughter cells of the amyloid precursor protein, and therefore all of the amyloid species, and that acts intracellularly, not extracellularly. So you can see such a variation even within this amyloid category. Then we have anti-amyloid vaccines, and we have other kinds of combinations where we're combining an anti-amyloid drug with an anti-tau drug. And so this is a pharmacodynamic combination now where you've got 2 drugs acting differently on different aspects of amyloid pathobiology, hopefully to get additive, if not synergistic effect. If we look at another example, the inflammation and immunity CADRO category, we can have drugs there that target microglia, astrocytes, innate immunity, calcium-related inflammation mediators, complement mediators of inflammation, cytokines, chemokines, goes on. And here you see from Dr. Cummings' publication a year ago, but still very relevant to the 2025 pipeline, that whether you are targeting TREM2 or TNF-alpha, nearly every drug is targeting a different aspect of inflammation for those drugs classified as the anti-inflammation portion of the drug development pipeline. And the largest group are those targeting microglial processes. And here it can be the resting microglia, it can be activated microglia. They do different things at different stages of the disease. So what are some of the major trends in Alzheimer's drug development? I've listed 10. This is not an exhaustive list, but the top 10 in my mind. We are enrolling biologically confirmed and biologically well-characterized participants, much more so than we did before. We are also intervening at earlier stages of the clinical continuum, with the MCI stage and the mild AD stage being the best represented, but all stages being represented. We have an emphasis on disease modification with 3/4 of the pipeline dedicated to those types of drugs. We have development and implementation of new clinical outcome measures. And I haven't really discussed these. I don't have time to go into that. But as you go earlier, you need different tools. It doesn't make sense to use cognitive tests or other clinical outcomes that look at what happens at moderate stage of disease when you're in the preclinical stage. So you need to be creative and understand how to pick up small changes, early changes. Other trends, more diverse compounds and mechanisms of action. We're definitely seeing this, building on this from last year, an enhanced repertoire of biomarker measures. And you heard about biomarkers in exciting developments in biomarkers in previous talks in this series. And not only are we using blood-based biomarkers more frequently, but biomarkers in general in Alzheimer's trials are among the primary endpoints in 27% of the active trials. That's a high number for primary endpoint inclusion. There are efforts to increase ethnic and racial diversity in the hope of making results applicable to the majority. There are attempts to decentralize trials and to increase the number of trials targeting the immune system. As we've seen over the last few years, that has continued. And combination therapies play an increasing role, as I've mentioned. So there are great opportunities in Alzheimer's drug development, and these are as follows. When we have increased numbers and increased diversity, we have an increased likelihood of success. And to use a Canadian analogy, a hockey analogy, more shots on goal. This is where we're going to get success. We can't put our eggs all in one basket. We're aiming towards precision medicine, and that becomes a reality when we thoroughly characterize our population biologically and clinically. And we need this because not all drugs are going to be appropriate or effective or even safe for all stages of disease. Combination therapies will increase efficacy, either with additive or synergistic benefits or with pharmacokinetic advantages that we haven't seen before. Repurposed drugs will reduce development time. You don't always need to have a phase 1 or phase 2 portion of drug development if a drug already has a very well demonstrated and proven safety record. We're aiming for less burdensome interventions as well, and I'm happy to say that in the current drug development pipeline of the biologics, we have some subcutaneous formulations. We also have a fair number of oral disease-modifying treatments. So that will again ease burden for healthcare system and for patients if you don't need infusion centers, etc. And vaccines with their infrequent dosing can offer benefits that way as well. Having interventions relevant to broader AD populations would definitely be enabled by including more diverse populations and having more countries involved in clinical trial work. Targeting earlier disease stages has the huge benefit of being able to prolong the less disabling stages of symptomatic Alzheimer's disease, but also secondary prevention in those who already have biologic changes, preventing them from going on to symptoms, and ultimately we would like to see primary prevention so people never develop this disease. So in summary, Alzheimer's drug development has historically been slow and challenging. The 2025 drug development pipeline draws on our updated understanding of Alzheimer's biology and on advances in biotechnology, be they biomarkers or shuttle approaches. The pipeline has grown since 2024 and notably has nearly doubled for drugs in phase 1. 15 CADRO categories are represented, and there are multiple subcategories, if you will, that provide additional mechanisms of action. Biomarkers play a key role for inclusion and for trial endpoints now. Repurposed drugs are represented in both disease-targeted therapies and symptom treatments. And combination therapies involve pharmacodynamic as well as pharmacokinetic approaches. So with that, I'll close and thank you for your interest in this topic.